Hello, welcome to EPG Padashala. I am Dr. Vamshi Krishna Reddy, Assistant Professor of English, Indian Institute of Technology, Tirupati. We are going to discuss a module on subjectivity, which is part of culture studies. This module is prepared by Dr. Vipin K. Kadawat from Banaras Hindu University. This module is intended to provide introduction to the issue of subjectivity in the broad domain of culture studies. In the course of this presentation, we will consider some major discussions on subject and subjectivity. Three such sites of cultural and philosophical reflection are the Enlightenment thought, psychoanalysis, and Foucauldian theory of power will be discussed in detail. First, let us discuss and try to define what is subjectivity. The notion of subject is closely linked to A. Our sense of self, that is, the unique experience of who we are and how we relate to others. Second, the formation and subsistence of personal and collective identities and ascriptions. The third is the construction and perpetuation of any reality that surrounds such identities. But what is subject? Or should we say, who is subject? What exactly is the difference between the who and the what? What is the relation between the subject and the object, or between the subjective and the objective? Is there any substance that we refer to by subject, or is it the body or mind? What is the relationship between the two, which is body and mind? Does it have definable properties? In this module, we are going to discuss about subject and subjectivity, the relationship between body and mind. Now, let us go to the fundamental question of subjectivity, that is I. How do we define I? What is I? The problem of the I and the self. We use this personal pronoun I to refer to our own self, which we consider as a unique and inimitable. But anyone talking about themselves would use the same word I. Therefore, the word I has nothing unique about itself. It is without content. It could be used with anyone. What does it tell us about the nature of subjectivity? Let's look at what is subjectivity and objectivity. In order to define what is subjectivity, we should also try to define what is objective. So, we use the word subjective or objective while expressing opinions on something. So, what is subjective? Subjective is precisely reflects our prejudices or our biases. These opinions or prejudices will come from us, whereas objective is the reality that as it is. Subjective is the prejudice, objective is reality as it is. For example, let us look at an image that is being provided in this module. In the image that is provided in the module, there are two individuals looking at a particular object. And the question of subjectivity and objectivity is clearly illustrated in this particular image. The first individual reads or counts the number given in the image as 4. And the second individual reads the same number or the image as 3 and disagrees with the first individual. So this is something subjective. The way you look at certain things, the way you perceive. Hence, two individuals looking at the same image and counting and giving the different numbers. Now let's discuss and get back to what is subject and how do we understand from different perspectives. For example, let's see how subject and religious discourse is interlinked or interconnected. It is likely that we all have wondered at some point as to what the meaning and the purpose of our true self is. Religion tells us our inner self is what may be called Atman, our soul, which is the fundamental truth or reality beyond the reach of material world. When I say beyond the reach of material world, which you cannot access, which you cannot gauge, which you cannot touch. The third one is unchangeable and indestructible. You can't really destroy it. And the fourth one is the subject manifests itself in different life forms. More or less, the definitions that I have listed out at this moment are reflected in philosophy of Hinduism. However, the notion of the subject as it developed in modern Western thought is radically different from this religious understanding of the self, because subject is rooted within material world of experiences, practices and thought in the Western context. So that the way we look at subject from, say, Indian context or Indian philosophical context and the Western philosophical context are completely different. Let us look at subject from Western point of view as well. Before that, let us go to what is the relationship between subjectivity and agency. Who is going to facilitate this subjectivity? In the subject and agency, the subject is also understood as a source and agent of action. For example, the grammatical subject in given a sentence in the module, the example that is given in the module is, he ate an apple. This is the sentence that is given in the module. Subject is understood here as autonomous and independent. Compare this same sentence with the phrase queen subjects. I'll repeat once again. Look at the previous sentence that I have given in the module, he ate an apple, and compare it with the phrase queen subjects. So the grammatical subject in he ate an apple is radically different from the phrase queen subjects, which is exact opposite of agency implied. The queen subjects are subjected to queen's monarchic power. Queen subjects are the ones who are ruled by the queen. The subjects are subjected to queen. This indicates that the process of becoming a subject is one closely linked to power, or as recent theorists would call, power relations. To be subject in this sense is to find oneself a place within naturalized social order. Subject is an idea which is part and parcel of this power matrix. Now, let us look at the other aspect of subjective and objective. The notion of the subjective as biased is inadequate to grasp the modern notion of the subject. But it demonstrates some crucial problems that are relevant for beginning to think about subjectivity. A context where the perceiving self and the perceived reality are separable from and independent of each other. B, the attempt of the self to arrive at an undistorted perception of the reality outside of it. Here, the notion of subjective as prejudice is inadequate precisely because the possibility of undistorted perception of reality by suppressing the subjective dimension as a whole is impossible to achieve. Or, in other words, any reality as we know it is possible only within experiential locus of mode of subjectivity. Now, let us look at, as I mentioned earlier in the module, let us look at subjectivity from different philosophical point of views. Let us look at the subjectivity through Enlightenment thought. Modernity ushered in a new understanding of the universe. Scientific attitude and Enlightenment rationalism questioned the certitude of pre-existing world order guaranteed by religious faith, or an unquestionable social coherence maintained by political authority or rigid social institution, such as caste in Indian context. The modern subject emerges from this disintegration of the pre-modern worldview. In a sense, the modernity opened the Pandora box of various issues, various institutions, such as religious faith, political authority, and various established institutions such as race, gender, caste, which were questioned by the emergence of modernity. So, the modern notion of the subject has gone into a radical change. The modern notion of subject is understood as a unique individual, the source and the agent of action, autonomous and independent. So, subject is associated with individuality, and the source as an agent of action, and subject is autonomous and independent. When we discuss subjectivity and subject and its relationship, we remember two key philosophers in this area. One is Descartes, the other is Immanuel Kant. These two philosophers are key Western philosophers who have contributed immensely to this particular subject. Let us look at Descartes, his life and his contribution to this particular subject. René Descartes was a French philosopher, mathematician, and a scientist, and he was considered as a father of modern Western philosophy. Much of the subsequent Western philosophy is either response to these writings or substantiating his writings. And his studies are closely studied, critically analyzed thereafter. Descartes' rationalism sought to eliminate all skepticism regarding the knowledge of the world. Our knowledge about the world was susceptible to radical skepticism, and this required a new foundation for the production of such knowledge. For Descartes, everything could be questioned except the self that questions. So for Descartes, self is the most important aspect. His philosophy is centered around self. He encapsulated this introspective awareness of his own act of thinking as one of his profound quotations, one of his profound philosophical quotations that we always remember when Descartes philosophy comes, that is, I think, therefore I am. It is the act of self-conscious thinking itself that grounds the certainty of the mind and proceeds to make sense of outside world. So in a sense, Descartes prioritizes self over everything else. So the following are the consequences of Descartes' theorization of subjectivity. The first is, the mind was considered to be an entity or substance as far as Descartes is concerned, which is independent of the material, substance or reality. Second, the material world and the immaterial mind were considered ontologically different and separate. Before one can surmise the certainty of the material world, the certainty of thinking mind needs to be secured. The act of self-conscious thinking grounds the possibility of reliable knowledge. So far we have covered the idea of subject and subjectivity according to Descartes. Let us look at another important philosopher who has equally dealt the idea of self, subjectivity and subject with equal rigor. Now let us look at Immanuel Kant's idea of subjective, especially on objectivity. Kant was a very important philosopher who tried to relate the possibility of objective knowledge and mind's role in it. For Kant, the subject refers to a formal precondition of all thinking, which is the I, that perceives and receives sensations. As all our experiences are connected to this I, we feel the continuity and stability of the self. Now, let us look at Immanuel Kant's ideas of phenomenon and noumenon. For Kant, a simple division between the subject that perceives and objective world that lies outside itself is not enough, as the reality itself is divided into phenomenon and noumenon. A noumenon, that which exists prior to our perceptions, and phenomenon, the image from the world that we form in our minds. Kant argues that phenomenon is what we receive as images of the world, whereas noumenon is a primordial thing in itself that is not accessible to human mind. What Kant calls transcendental subject is not a material entity or empirical self, but the source of all experience and consciousness. The transcendental subject, in other words, is a space where the images of our sense, perception, and faculties of the mind can be organized and united into a continuous experience of the self. As Nick Mansfield argues, Kant's subject is not merely in the world, allowing its messages to cross back and forth across its senses. When it receives these messages, it is not merely passive. It grasps the outside world in a positive act of thought that not only connects it with things, but gives it a strong, unified, and purposeful sense of selfhood. It may be clear by now, Descartes was a rationalist for his radical skepticism of sense experience, and Kant was somebody who tried to resolve this conflict between rationalism and empiricism. Now, so far we have looked at Immanuel Kant's and Descartes' ideas of subject and subjectivity. Let us proceed further with the module with contemporary theories of the subject. Let us look at critics or critique of modern subjectivity. So far we have mentioned how subjectivity is constituted as a central problem for modern philosophy. We analyzed how common understanding of being subjective as biased is inadequate to understand subjectivity. We looked at Descartes, Immanuel Kant's contributions. We understand the problem of whether the subject is substance, like other material substances, was central to modern philosophical inquiry. Now, we turn to more contemporary understanding of subjectivity, especially two important streams of thought. Here, I am going to cover two important philosophical streams that are psychoanalysis and Foucauldian theory. Now, let us look at the basic premises of critique of subjectivity. Contemporary theories of subjectivity questions. For Descartes, subject meant the self-transparent and stable entity that is reflexively apprehended in the act of thinking. The unified, autonomous notion of subject that emerged within Enlightenment thought. The subject now was understood to be incoherent, split, contradictory, and unstable. The stability of our experience is due to the workings of social institutions that conceals the internal contradictions of the subject. Further, it was argued that subject is an effect of power. Now let us look at what does psychoanalysis to offer about subject and subjectivity. In psychoanalysis, one of the prominent figure and philosopher we have is Sigmund Freud. Psychoanalysis is a clinical therapeutic practice developed by Sigmund Freud. It traces the constitution of a mind to the developmental process of a person from childhood to adulthood. Sexual development of a person is given importance in psychoanalytical thinking. The Oedipal complex plays a crucial role in it. The most important contribution of Freud is considered to be the discovery of unconscious. It proposes a split between the conscious and unconscious sides of subjects and a subtle, irreducible influence of unconscious over the conscious. Freud proposed that excess is the hallmark of subject and explained that unconscious as a repository of the excesses that is inexorably and necessarily excluded from what is deemed normal adult social existence. Though the unconscious is inaccessible in our conscious life, such as dreams, slips of tongue, neurotic symptoms, etc., bring some of its dimensions to our experience that could be either pleasurable or disturbing. Freud, however, was very close to the Enlightenment legacy in that he understood the aim of psychoanalytical critical practice as a way of analyzing the neurotic symptoms within particular trajectory of person's development and renormalize him or her as socially acceptable member. The excessive reliance on the particular model of bourgeois family and use of sexual and anatomic references, especially the presence of or absence of penis, as always faithful to the formation of subjectivity, have always been criticized by later thinkers. Another important philosopher who comes under psychoanalysis is Jacques Lacan. Lacan is considered is one of the finest psychoanalytical thinker. He considered language as a primary locus of subjectivity. If Freud believed that the unconscious, a subterranean space within every individual mind that is not directly accessible to him or herself, Lacan thought that the truth of subject lies outside, which is in language. We generally think of human beings using language as a tool of communication, where the subject comes into existence first and then instrumentally appropriates language for communicating with others. The reverse sequence would be where language already exists before anybody is born, and she or he will have to locate within the language for occupying a meaningful position in this world. This particular thought has been expanded by another Marxist theoretician called Louis Althusser. Louis Althusser is a French Marxist theoretician who would appropriate these Lacanian insights into work out a theory of ideology, which would explain the production of subjectivities within capitalism. According to Althusser, ideology represents the imaginary relationships of the individuals to their real conditions of existence. It is through operations of ideology that working class submits to capitalist mode of production, despite of the fact that it exploits and deprives it of its freedom. Althusser suggests that ideology is different from force such as schools, family, political institutions, etc., that reinforces capitalist values. Now, let us proceed further and discuss subject and subjectivity according to Michel Foucault, who is a very important philosopher in this area. Foucault's fundamental assertion is that the individual is only a secondary, an effect of power. For this, Foucault substantially reverses an earlier notion of individual. He says individual is only secondary, the primary is power. Power is superior to the individual in a sense. The earlier one was romantic notion of individual who is suppressed by social rules and regulations without the possibility of complete self-expression. This is the figure we see in the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, where the individual, autonomous and free, comes first, then is imprisoned by social and political power. If Lacan traces the formation of subject within the familial linguistic context, the Foucault's primary concern was to see how subjects are formed within specific historical situations through operations of social institutions, practices of inclusion and inclusion, forms of knowledge, etc. Foucault's work, which has provided fresh grounds to think about the question of subjectivity, is in disagreement with the fundamental assertions of A. Marxism, B. Psychoanalysis. One of the fundamental assertions of Foucault is that there are no hidden truths the way psychoanalysis will conceive in the form of inaccessible unconscious or Marxist understanding of ideology that conceals the real relations of production. For Althusser, ideology produces an imaginary worldview which successfully hides the true relations of exploitations and oppressions that capitalism produces. But the truth can be accessed and explained through a Marxist science. Whereas for Foucault, such underlying truths do not exist, and any claim to truth is a construct involving power. For example, it is the medical discourse of mentally ill, which is historically formed and therefore not universal truths about what mental illness is all about, which creates subject positions of normal and abnormal. The form of modern power, according to Foucault, is more dispersed without any specific point of origin, but also productive in that it works on the individuals to produce themselves as subjects through mental and physical reform. Foucault discusses the architectural configuration of panopticon as a model of power that operates in the modern societies, applicable to as diverse institutions as schools, factories, hospitals, etc. Panopticon is a prison structure where each subject is confined to his cell and is continuously observed by invisible, all-seeing person. So far, in this module, we started discussing about what is subject and what is subjectivity according to certain philosophies, and we started with Indian philosophies and gradually we moved to Western philosophies. We started with Enlightenment period, where we started with how Immanuel Kant or Descartes thought about self and subjectivity and subject, how subject is constructed and defined. Then gradually we moved to psychoanalysis and Foucauldian theories. In between we have discussed Marxist approach to self and subjectivity through Althusser. So in this module we have so far covered various approaches, theories to understand what is subject and subjectivity. To proceed further, to conclude, the attempt in this module was to trace discussions of subjectivity by looking at Enlightenment traditions and two contemporary trajectories of theorizing, which I've already mentioned, psychoanalysis and Foucauldian theory. The Enlightenment tradition posited subjectivity as self-reliant and transparent contemporary theories, questioned these assumptions, whereas psychoanalysis proposed a split between the conscious and unconscious sides of subjectivity. So Enlightenment was more with self and, whether self was dependent or self was transparent or self-reliant, and psychoanalysis was to do with conscious and subconscious trajectories. And then we moved on to Foucauldian theory, which questioned the existence of autonomous entity called the individual and argued that it is only an effect of power relations produce social institutions and practice. So in a sense, Foucauldian theory deals with power and power relations. There are other theoretical developments that have had substantial effect on how we think about subjectivity, such as structuralism, post-structuralism, theories of gender, performativity, race, caste, post-colonial experiences, and as they critique the Enlightenment notion of autonomous and agentive self, they also try to unmask the particular subjects, the new subjects, European male, upper caste, or within a dominant structure that masquerade as the universal. The question of subjectivity has therefore been a center of cultural analysis in contemporary world. Hence, this module has covered right from the Enlightenment period to the contemporary approaches to understand what is subject and how do we understand subjectivity. For further questions and details, one can look at the e-text and one can go ahead with references to further reading. Thank you.